Empathy, the big one. You have to be able to kind of put yourself in someone else's shoes, standpoint theory and everything, where you have to show others that you are not only understanding of them, but that you are like trying and seeking to see things from their view in order to make the most equal and like respectable decisions. And then finally, social skills, which kind of wraps it all up. You're able to manage good interpersonal relationships, um, like by having good control of yourself and then others. So these components, when they are well developed and work together, is where we can sort of see them in the systems theory model. And like with everything, they do fall into all three categories in a way, because emotional intelligence is largely seen as sort of like you're sort of born with it for the most part. Like people see, however, there are ways to grow and develop it. So that could be relevant background factors. Internal influences, it's going to exist throughout these groups and the types of groups you have, how leadership is conducted, all the group norms. However, I think that a key focus of emotional intelligence and its impact overall in groups falls in the consequences category. You can see like the benefits of developing healthy interpersonal relations and improved information flow just from those components of being self-aware and self-regulatory in order to then get others to act in ways that you kind of want, not in a manipulative way, but just it's better driving forward. And so then into interpersonal growth and overall organizational change. A quote from, not really a quote, but good old Daniel Goleman in his $9 study told me that, so his studies have actually found that emotional intelligence is twice as important to possess as other common workplace-related skills for jobs at all levels, so be it like technical skills or just like other traits people don't necessarily consider to be part of emotional intelligence. It is more valued, and then he actually took that research a step further, and that's for jobs at all levels, but at jobs of higher up and like managerial, it's actually over IQ and other technical skills being sought out. So it's important to keep in mind for these consequences, if you want to make them positive consequences and not negative, that actually focusing on emotional intelligence as part of who you are in your organizations and in life in general is an important point to make. So then in applying this, you can using implicit and explicit perception checking, which we talked about in the first week when we actually first brought up emotional intelligence, and it was revisited in some concept keys. We've already been over it once tonight, but so you're going to describe the behavior you see, interpret behavior, and then ask for clarification. So that kind of just goes to show your levels of self-awareness and being able to relate to others empathetically and knowing what's going to drive them forward. And then, however, the biggest ways after that is that's just like a simple tool to use. But participating in other available tools to actually grow your level of emotional intelligence. We did it with the reading of the mind test. You can like be more aware of how people are like feeling, how they're thinking just through visual cues. Other ways can be done through meditation. A lot of people, especially in recent years, have, not really recent, it's been around for a while, but people have finally sort of given it like more praise that it serves in the business world. I just finished reading a book called Meditation for the Fidgety Skeptic, and so it's basically a guy who was in a very high stress job, and he found that he was developing like really high levels of depression and anxiety, which in and of themselves, if you don't have that, then your other components of emotional intelligence are going to be lacking, which can then bleed into other aspects of your work life. So he was super skeptical about meditation and the whole emotional aspect of it. But after giving it a try, he found that it really is worth it. And so he wrote this book and like made an app for these people who aren't into like the whole namaste and like chilling out zen all day, but like just putting aside 5 minutes, because it really can. You just take the time to actually practice and work on your emotional intelligence skills, then you're going to do better. And with that, then he found that in several cases, people who wanted to improve, it's one thing to just say you want to improve, but to actually do it. So a big tip he gave was to actually request feedback and be ready to critically like receive it with an open mind, and use the feedback you get to then practice. He says, he basically ends it in the most cliche way of just practice, 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 because although many people think that they can't get better at like listening, which we can go into later, and like being more empathetic or connecting with others, it really is, you just have to want to do it. That neurologist that I brought up about the sociopathic brains, when people started to like tell him that they weren't that surprised that the parts of his brains weren't lighting up, it was like an awakening for him where he's just like, I can be more empathetic, I just have to be aware that I'm not. So he had to work on his self-awareness, and just by putting it in the forefront of his mind, he got to then become closer and build better relationships, which is now a huge part of what he's focusing on in life. It's just overall a great thing to better yourself, and because it really is like a superpower when you're working with your groups if you have a high level of emotional intelligence.
So my pearl that I chose to speak about is being able, you should be able to recognize different types of conflict in order to determine how to manage it or handle it strategically. So essentially, a successful leader is really able to discern between a conflict of ideas and a conflict of feelings. And I think it's really, really hard. One of the best stories that I can think of, this year I was an orientation leader, and we have to take care of these student balloons for the week of training. And I chose to think outside of the box. There were very simple rules. Had to be visible at all times, had to be within honor person at all times. So I chose to put my new student in Tupperware because I wanted to protect him, I wanted him to last all week and have a great time at orientation. So essentially, throughout the week, some of the coordinators decided that they didn't like the Tupperware idea. And so basically, we engaged in this conflict of ideas, a conflict about what was legal, what wasn't legal. And essentially, I allowed a conflict of ideas to become a conflict of feelings because I felt personally attacked. So, in review, a conflict of ideas is simply task-related conflict, where an idea of a conflict of feelings is essentially taking a task-related conflict and making it personal. So really, again, an effective leader is able to identify between these two, and definitely task-related conflict is really preferable to personality conflict, just because it approaches conflict as a problem to be solved together, rather than a conflict of where one side is going to win. Additionally, really personality-based conflict, it really does disrupt the flow of activities, and hopefully wasn't too disruptive for orientation, but anyway, so again, good leaders know how to spot effective conflict versus conflict that is not strategic for success within an organization. And really, a leader should only step in when conflict is no longer positively moving forward to engagement, because there are definitely positives to conflict, and we won't spend a lot of time on those today, but we did talk about those earlier in class. So in terms of mediation, we had Peggy Lucan come to speak about conflict and her role as a mediator in conflict, and she pointed out these ideas of conflict escalators. And basically, these include, not limited to, raising voices, poor body language, and really like threatening their personal safety, and just ultimately making them feel like they are not heard. So a good leader also knows how to manage this conflict, and is kind of this idea of they want to assuage conflict, to make it go away, to move towards consensus, to take a more task-related approach to managing conflict, coming at it together from both sides. So initially, there's this idea of really lowering the intensity, and I really liked how Kyle talked about indirect and direct perception checking. We've heard a lot about that tonight. But a way to lower the intensity is really just to ask them, hey, like, can we let's step away from this for a second. Like, this is what you're thinking, so asking what they're thinking, clarifying what they're thinking, and then responding to that. Saying, I think you're thinking this, is that right? And then going forward from there. That's one way to lower that intensity. Asking clarifying questions, so not necessarily direct perception checking, but just asking clarifying questions, because a lot of conflict escalates from simple misunderstandings of ideas. Communicating clearly, I think that's the whole idea of communication, is being able to communicate clearly, creating that shared meaning in someone else, and you can accomplish that through a lot of ways, more than the brevity of today. And ultimately, listening, I love this quote, listening first to understand and then to be understood. So listening first to understand what the other person is saying, not necessarily forming a response, just listening, just sitting and allowing that space, allowing your mind, your schema to activate around what the other person is saying, and then working on that. So continuing off this idea, there was this blogger named Dave Matten, and he works for this company called Sandler Training, which is a professional teamwork development company. And he really suggested that sometimes breaking up into small groups also allowed for diversity to be heard, to make sure that all of the different items are being brought to the table and then coming back to the table to discuss those ideas and then celebrate the resolution of conflict. And then a professor from the University of Southern California, I'm going to try to pronounce her name. Her name is Anne Merjak. She talks about this idea of idea convergence, where people, or idea divergence, I apologize, where people are always going to bring these different perspectives to the table. We all have different perspectives. That's part of what forms diversity. So we're going to go out, we're going to take all of these perspectives, and then we're going to try to bring them back into a consensus that we can then act on. So that is the idea of concept of idea divergence and then idea convergence. So essentially, today I've kind of reviewed a lot. That was a lot to throw at you, but essentially a true leader knows how to guide a group through this process of conflict and ultimately managing it strategically so that people are motivated to act on the sequence. We've talked a lot about this class just in a couple of Dr. J's classes, this concept of motivated sequence, and that connection drives response. So the more connected to a consensus or response, a summation of ideas, the more connected that a group feels to that, the more likely they are to respond and go forth with that idea. So you can hit the next slide. So essentially, conflict falls within the internal influences. I think it's most informed by these attitudes and values. I think, yes, you can make the argument for a lot of them, but I think a lot of the conflict is how we feel about things, whether we like it, whether we don't, and then our values, what we believe is morally wrong or morally right. And a lot of that does stem into how we manage conflict, which ultimately, conflict goes into solutions and all of these different consequences in different ways. We're not going to spend a super long time about that, because I think we've definitely hit that a lot. So you can go to the next slide. So in terms of personal application, the first thing that you want to do is really determine, is this a conflict of ideas or is this a conflict of feelings? Does it center on a task-related issue, or has it turned the corner into a personal reality? And ultimately, is this conflict productive? Because even if the conflict goes into personality-related conflict, if the conflict is production, if Mary and I have an issue and we're working out an issue, it's productive. It's ultimately leading somewhere so that we can get back on track to a task-related conflict. So ultimately, asking those kind of questions really is going to allow a leader to determine, do I need to step into the situation, or can I let this conflict run its course? We talked about using de-escalating techniques, so try to ask those questions to kind of reduce the intensity of the moment. Really being curious by asking clarifying questions, clarifying what they mean by something, communicating clearly using I statements, saying, I feel this way, and then following that up with perception checking. And then ultimately, just really listening with understanding as a main goal. I think a lot of the times we listen to respond, but listening to understand and focusing on that will help you with that as well. And then ultimately, establishing the rule of reciprocity, so establishing what's important, what's negotiable, and why. And another will allow you to really manage conflict effectively. So we're going to do a short activity. So we are going to decide where we would like to eat at the end of class next week to celebrate the end of class. So I'm going to hand you, so essentially I'm handing you 3 different menus for places on the plaza. And as a group, I would like you guys to come up. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. So I would like you to come up with where we're going to eat. So take into account price, menu options, all of that kind of things. And ultimately, I invite you to use clarifying questions. So asking what's important to another, why they're feeling that way, and then determining what's negotiable. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes, and then I'll check back in with you guys, okay?
Yeah, it's so long.
I don't trust the Cheesecake Factory. I'm just going to put it out there.
Why do you not trust the Cheesecake Factory?
They try and do too much. You
All kinds of food from everywhere.
exactly. Like,
So it's
you
how-
can't be better than them. You need
is
to have a
Cheesecake
thing
Factory
you're good at. I don't.
expensive?
I trust their cheesecake, but then they need to chill out with the rest of their menu.
Okay, so just to clarify, our dinner
In
options
comparison, restaurants do have
Capital Grill. Let's do it.
Oh, I don't know anything about the Capitol
I've
Grill.
only been there once. It was interesting.
Where?
I
Yeah, I know.
outside of Capitol Grill.
What?
And then,
What?
it's a long story.
So
I
think
actually
about
wrote a
what
paper
you're
on
hungry
it.
for right now. What sounds
That's
good?
like one type of food.
I mean, I'm kind of biased because I used to work at the
So I mean, if you guys trust Cheesecake Factory, I guess.
I know for a fact their kitchen is like
So guys, think about price. Think about what you're starving for, what you've never experienced before. Really just opening your minds up to different things.
So I would say it's most of the time. It's the biggest, like the widest variety.
Yeah,
It's
it's
very, very specific.
that's
Does anyone not like Asian food?
Lobster lamb sounds amazing.
I don't mind
well, what if I said my ex-fiance works there, so I won't
I've
serve
never
sluts.
had that before.
Look at the hundreds of kinds of cheesecake you can get. I don't mind
I
trying anything.
understand that they have cheesecake. That is what I like.
You need dessert? Okay. They have dessert here?
Yeah, I think it accidentally printed off, so I can grab you the dessert
Oh, they
page.
have a gluten-free menu. Anybody
Do you
gluten-free?
need the dessert page?
They have desserts, they do. They have 8 delicious mini desserts. And 1 large, no, they have a couple. Banana spring rolls.
Fun because you can.
Asian jambalaya pasta, I am
Has chocolate cake
A-okay with the cheesecake.
You just want a slice of cheesecake.
Here's your dessert.
Oh, we already
From
got
PF
it.
Chang's.
What if we ate
Alright.
PF Chang's and then pick up the cheesecake on the way out?
We found a compromise.
Cheesecake to go.
All right, guys, take about 30 seconds. Wrap up your deliberations and
Across.
get ready to deliver your final result.
Cool. I like that. So
That was a
we
short 30
mixed
seconds.
Capitol Grill,
I guess.
too expensive.
I've never had to pay one of those.
Times are tough.
All right, so where are we going to eat this group? What did we decide?
We're gonna head to the Cheesecake
We're
Factory.
gonna head to the Cheesecake Factory. All right, this group, where are you guys headed?
We're going to PF Chang's and we're getting Cheesecake Factory to go.
Ooh, little collaboration. Okay. All right. So what kind of situations did you experience in this? How did you manage conflict? Because I know some of it said it was too expensive. Like variety of options. But
I
yeah.
just bullied them all into
Oh, good.
She really did.
Good. Awesome.
And I believe
You
them
were
and you
listening.
not.
I love it. How to manage conflict effectively. Good.
Well, I did, I got
Well, I was
Good.
surprised that you agreed on PF Chang's with the ex-fiancé.
Yeah.
I got over it.
Okay. So did you guys have any deliberations? Any tense conflicts?
I don't trust Cheesecake Factory.
Okay.
So I won't eat
You don't
there.
You don't trust it?
Started
No.
with that. That was her lead.
We then got rid of Capitol Grill because of price point.
Gotcha.
PF Chang's we're all into, and then I am allowing them to go pick up cheesecake after. That's all.
Fair enough.
Yeah, because we needed a dessert. That was a
Yeah.
mandatory
Okay.
thing.
I would love
That was a
for you to
non-negotiable.
tell me why
Because
you don't trust
you can't have Italian and Mexican and a cheeseburger and then cheesecake. You need to just pick something. They're trying too much. They can't be good at it all.
They're pretty
But
good.
because they have so many options, you don't
Yeah,
trust
I like
Kyle, did you have any?
Yeah, they're all pretty good.
They're but it's
All
like,
right, let's bring it back to the task.
Yeah, initially
Not
I
authentic.
wanted to have changed because,
Uh-huh.
can I see it again? I forgot it.
Only on Piers Law.
No,
She
no,
knows
it's,
it.
I worked at PF Chang's, so.
yeah, I actually wanted to try that,
Okay.
but also because I wanted to bring out the emotions of my
Okay. Fair. Fair. So essentially, guys, I hope this was a good activity. It sounded like you guys worked through a little bit of conflict. I think it's hard to kind of establish conflict in general, but essentially, I hope you guys took away that it's important to ask clarifying questions and establishing why something is important to you. So Maggie saying, I don't trust it, this is why, we're not going there. So essentially, that was the goal with that activity. So I think now we're going to wrap up with Avery, and she's going to talk about how to teach you how to effectively listen.
So our last pearl is on how to effectively listen. Okay. So effectively listening plays a crucial role in being able to determine the success of your messages and whether or not how they're received or successful or not. And effective listening stems from being able to utilize both through your nonverbals and your verbals that you are showing that you are listening. Okay. So anyone who might have took the intro communications class remembers that we did go over the transactional model of communication. And listening for me falls kind of back into that channel of feedback. Because if you remember this model, it basically says that you cannot not communicate. Even as I send a message and it goes to the receiver, I'm still sending a channel of feedback and both receiving a channel of feedback, either as a sender by seeing whether or not they're showing you through their nonverbals, whether or not they understand either by like seeing that they're very attentive or if they're like a very engaged or if they seem disengaged, they're communicating back to me. So basically this model represents that we are both simultaneously as the sender and receiver communicating through our nonverbals and our verbals that we use. Okay. So listening falls underneath, for me, I saw them underneath all three because depending on, if you go back to that model a little bit, depending on your field of experience or your relevant background factors will determine whether or not how well you do listen, and then how well you listen affects your communication, or the success of your communication, your conflicts, and your decision making, which